Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, on this episode, we need to talk about something that should be completely unthinkable, but somehow isn't anymore. The US president kicked Ukraine's president out of the White House. Not a war criminal, not an authoritarian strongman, but the president of a democratic country fighting for its survival. A US ally ejected like a contestant on a reality show. Remember The Apprentice? Yeah, that kind of vibe, exactly. When Donald Trump won back the White House, many were skeptical about what would happen to Ukraine. Thing is, after the disastrous televised free-for-all at the Oval Office, we know even less. Why was Trump acting that way? Was it really an ambush? Did President Zelenskyy go too hard in response, an idealist in the world of no-holds-barred business talks? Or is there even more happening behind the scenes, even as we speak? Without further ado, let's get into it with our latest report.
Top Western leaders convened in London for a high-stakes summit with one goal in mind: support for Kyiv. Hosted by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the gathering brought together senior representatives from 15 nations. Leaders have rallied behind Zelenskyy following what many saw as his humiliating treatment by Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance during their White House meeting on February 28th. However, some officials are urging Zelenskyy to repair ties with Trump to ensure continued American support.
Regardless of what happened earlier, despite everything, we remain constructive. We thought that the mineral agreement would be signed. On our side, we are ready to sign. Honestly, I think the US will be ready as well. Probably some time is needed to analyze certain things. I just wanted Ukraine's position to be heard.
In a bid to keep diplomatic efforts alive, Starmer announced that the UK, France and Ukraine will take the lead in drafting a joint ceasefire plan to present to the US administration.
But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing. We're working with the US on this point after my meeting with President Trump last week. And let me be clear, we agree with the President on the urgent need for a durable peace.
But as politicians focus on their work, Ukraine's military focuses on its own tasks. On February 28th, several dozen Ukrainian citizens living abroad signed contracts with the Armed Forces of Ukraine in Lublin, Poland, to join the Ukrainian Legion, a brigade undergoing formation in Poland.
We are seeing more applications from women and young people. Interest is coming from all over the world, with volunteers from the US, Canada, Estonia, Norway and Germany. The geographical reach is expanding, and we are on the right track.
Anonymous, the international hacker organization, has expressed support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people following the heated exchange between Trump and Zelenskyy and the White House, declaring a cyber war against Russia.
And now it's time to examine this story in greater detail. So, let's begin. President Zelenskyy arrived at the White House for what should have been a tense but diplomatic meeting. Instead, he got a verbal beatdown from both President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, it usually only takes one of them to argue with a world leader, but apparently against Zelenskyy, it had to be a tag team effort. Trump and Vance berated Zelenskyy for, wait for it, not being grateful enough.
They should have.
Have you said thank you once? This
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
Yeah, I don't think we expected the alleged leader of the free world to demand a war-torn country's president to bow down in gratitude. Zelenskyy, to his credit, pushed back. He reminded them he had thanked the American people countless times, including earlier that same day. But the problem was that Trump and Vance seemingly weren't looking for thanks. They were looking for submission. And if you're thinking, wow, Trump really let him have it, I bet he gives Putin the same treatment, then congratulations on being an optimist, because so far he hasn't really criticized the dictator even once. In fact, he called Zelenskyy the dictator before backing down shortly before the Oval Office meeting. A mercurial attitude indeed. Trump's decision to downplay Russia's responsibility for the war, or the menace it continues to present, is clearly evident. Over the weekend, Trump suggested in a social media post that America should be more worried about immigrant gangs and drug dealers than Vlad the invader. But arguably, what he said during the infamous Oval Office fracas was even worse. Believe it or not, Trump actually complained that Zelensky has hatred for Putin.
See the hatred he's got for Putin. It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate. He's got tremendous hatred.
How dare you, President Zelensky, hating on a man committing war crimes in your own country on a daily basis, slaughtering civilians and ruining entire cities? Oh, how rude of you. You just don't do that in a polite society. Sarcasm aside, it's not terribly hard to understand why Zelensky isn't feeling warm and fuzzy towards the man responsible for 3 years of open war, plus assorted annexations and war crimes from 2014 onwards, and yet Trump seems to take offense on Putin's behalf, which is baffling, to say the least. Oh, but it gets worse. After the meeting, Trump went on to claim that President Zelensky doesn't want peace. Now, there is exactly one person who could end this war tomorrow unilaterally with a single order, and that is Vladimir Putin. But he won't, because he doesn't want peace, he wants Ukraine. Meanwhile, Zelensky does want peace, but he wants a fair peace. One where Ukraine isn't just left to pick up the pieces and prepare for the next Russian invasion in 5 years. One that actually means security, justice, and stability. What a wild concept, right? And trusting Vladimir Putin with holding up his end of a ceasefire is as reliable as listening to a drunk slurring his words on New Year's Eve about his dry January plans.
And he broken 25 times. That's why we will never accept just ceasefire. It will not work without security guarantees.
At the present stage, there is still much that we don't know. Some say the whole clash was actually planned, an ambush long in the making. Others see this as a confrontation of personalities, like Mentos and Coca-Cola in close proximity. Not a good idea. Anyway, questions remain. Does the US want to sacrifice Ukraine for the sake of reverse Nixon maneuvering to splinter the Russia-China alliance? Does Trump want to prod Europe into action, or to throw it to the wolves too? The sheer amount of known and unknown unknowns today would leave even Don Rumsfeld scratching his head in utter bewilderment. Could Zelensky have been more diplomatic? Possibly, but then again, imagine maintaining a cool composure while your nation fights for survival. However, we are outside the Oval Office now, and perhaps composure is exactly what we need on both sides of the pond. Because in the end, there is definitely one backstabber in the room with us. His name is Vladimir, and he likes signing deals only to break them shortly thereafter. It's been done before, you know. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning, thank you for inviting me.
So, what is your take on the confrontation at the Oval Office? Do you think it was, as some have suggested, an ambush set against President Volodymyr Zelensky?
Sometimes you have to be a psychiatrist to try to understand these issues, not a political scientist, because it doesn't make a lot of rational sense. Trump was desperate for two things: the signing of a mineral agreement with Ukraine, and also to come out as a kind of a peacemaker and to get a peace agreement, to get Zelensky to agree to a peace agreement, which seemed to be close to what Russia was demanding, not what Ukraine was asking for. So if Trump wanted those two things, it wasn't logical for Trump and Vance to pre-organize an ambush, but it seems that's what they did. And you can only explain that by the assumption that they assumed that the ambush would not derail Trump getting these two documents signed, because they assumed that Zelensky was so weak that he would basically, like in a mafia film, kiss the ring of President Trump and say, okay, I agree to give away the minerals and I agree to sign whatever you have on a peace agreement. That didn't happen. Zelensky pushed back. began demanding, some links to security guarantees, for example. And that's when I think the meeting collapsed, because the pre-planned, as it were, approach to this, that Zelensky would just agree to anything and he would kiss, my ring and everything else. And then we would also belittle him because Trump does have a personal hatred for Zelensky. That didn't happen.
Would you say that is Trump or more J.D. Vance? Some people said that Trump kept this reasonably civil at the beginning. Of course, he did have a few things on which he does not agree with President Zelensky. But some suggested that it was actually J.D. Vance who basically pushed this whole thing off the rails, because he started to interfere. He started to ask questions to President Zelensky which were confrontational, to say the least. What would you say about this particular theory? Would J.D. Vance have an interest to see this fail?
I think this is an attempt to sort of kind of provide some kind of defense of Trump. I disagree on this. Trump has a personal... we know that he maintains a personal grudge against people who he sees have kind of attacked him. And he has a hatred for Zelensky a personal hatred for Zelensky going back to the first impeachment back in 2019, 2020, when Zelensky refused to agree with Trump to kind of dig up dirt on Biden. And then there was this famous phone call. This led to Trump's first impeachment. And then the second grudge against Zelensky is that, and which Vance raised, was that the Ukrainians have always kind of, in elections, campaigned for the Democrats against Trump and against him personally. So he has a personal grudge. If Trump really wasn't interested in this squabbling, firstly, he wouldn't have... he would have curtailed Vance's comments. He would have said, "Come on, that's enough." He didn't do that. And secondly, he wouldn't have allowed this stupid question from a pro-Trump website, Breitbart, to be asked about Zelensky's suit, his clothes. And then after he'd asked that question, Trump turned around to that idiot and basically said, "Well done." So I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that Trump is in charge here, and he's surrounded himself by sycophants who basically are the ones who do everything he says. And the idea that somehow Vance is an independent actor is simply untrue.
And also, we should probably add that the journalist who was asking that particular question was later on revealed to be privately linked to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is known as being one of the most outspoken members of the Make America Great Again movement. And she often criticized Ukraine even before Trump won the elections. Now, coming back to the implications of all this, apparently Trump will get together with the top members of his team to discuss what's going to happen with Ukraine next. Do you think there is a real risk that military aid could be suspended? Because this is what they are actually apparently going to be talking about.
Well, that's what they're talking about today, yes. And it's not just military aid, it's aid in general, non-military aid as well. I suspect that this is probably going to go in that direction. Let's remember that the only aid from the US that's been still continuing is aid which has been agreed by Biden. Trump has not authorized any aid of his own. And there was a 6-month period already where Trump instructed the Republicans in Congress to block aid going to Ukraine. So I suspect this is where it's going to lead to. It's impossible for me to see, and the subset to all of this is, the British and the Europeans who gathered in London over the weekend are going to present their kind of peace proposals to Trump. I simply don't see Trump coming on board, because firstly, he wants to deal directly with Putin. He has this, obsession with dealing with so-called strongmen directly in the old Yalta mode. He doesn't respect not only Ukrainians, he doesn't respect Europeans, irrespective of how much they spend on defense. And secondly, Trump wants to be the man himself to get credit for peace. He doesn't want to get peace agreed together with the Europeans, so they get some of the credit as well. So I think that it's likely to go in that direction to, at the very least, suspend aid. Let's remember the US just a few days ago suspended or ended counter cyber warfare against Russia, which rather strange for them to do without any, demanding anything from Russia in advance.
So, looking at this from this perspective, you've mentioned the meeting taking place recently with European leaders declaring their continuing and unwavering support of Ukraine. But do they have what it takes to provide, to deliver on that promise? Because later on, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk came out and said, of course, we want to help Ukraine, but there is no unity. For example, on the question of Russian assets. We, Poland, the Baltic states, we are convinced these assets should be confiscated and used to help Ukraine, but other countries, not so much. What does it tell us about the alleged unity among European nations here? Not to mention, countries like Hungary or Slovakia, which are completely against any sort of moves being made in that direction, right?
Well, all of these things you've talked about are nothing new with Trump, are they? I mean, the disagreements about whether to confiscate or not confiscate frozen Russian assets have been taking place under Biden. It's not something that's appeared in Europe. I mean, the British and Americans and Canadians in favor, kind of the Germans, French less so. East Europeans in favor. That was true under Biden as well. And on the question of unity, I'm British. To me, it's rather romantic to believe that 32 members of the European Union would agree always on everything. I mean, there's too many countries. So the idea that there's going to be complete unity is always going to be, I think, not the case. And Slovakia and Hungary are not, again, these are not new problems for the European Union.
One final question, because we're running out of time. Prime Minister Donald Tusk also said that Europe really should change its mentality, because in terms of population and potential, Europe is massive. Thing is, he's suggesting we don't really believe in this capability that we have. We don't seem to understand that we could actually use all the potential that we have, except for lack of unity, except for lack of decision-making capabilities and all that.
Well, that's because until now, European Union hasn't really acted as a kind of a security bloc. And NATO has been led by the US. Without US leadership, NATO and Europe are going to have to kind of become a more unified security actor. So I don't think that, again, is unusual. On the question, just quickly on the military side, military aid, Ukraine at the moment is producing about 40% of its own military equipment, using domestic funds and funds from the West, Western governments, and also the interest accrued on those frozen assets have been given to Ukraine. And that's likely to rise to about 50%. The other 50% has come from European and British sources and from the United States and Canada. I think that the Europeans and Canadians maybe will be unable to completely at the moment cover what if the US pulls out. But I think they're going to approach it in that direction. It's not going to make a massive difference. I mean, let's remember the Europeans have donated, Europeans and British have donated more than the Americans in the last 3 years. So yes, it's going to be difficult, but it's not going to be the case that Ukraine suddenly collapses and Russia wins the war. So we shouldn't assume that's going to happen as well. It's going to be difficult, but it's not going to be tragic.
So there's another challenge that Europe now has to rise up and face in order to allow Ukraine to stand its ground against Russia. Professor Taras Kozio was a guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you for inviting me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. A Russia-linked oil tanker suspected of sabotaging undersea Baltic cables has been allowed to leave Finnish waters after being held for more than 2 months. 3 of its crew members, however, remain barred from leaving the country as the investigation continues.
The vessel Eagle S, registered in the Cook Islands, is accused of dragging a tanker along the seabed on December 25th last year, damaging an electrical cable and 4 telecommunication lines. The Swedish Navy recovered the missing anchor in January. While Finnish police continue their investigation, they stated that forensic examinations aboard the tanker no longer justify its detention. However, 8 crew members remain under suspicion, with 3 still barred from leaving Finland. Authorities expect to conclude the probe by the end of April. Security analysts believe the Eagle S is part of Russia's so-called Shadow Fleet, a network of vessels used to bypass Western sanctions on its oil exports amid the war in Ukraine. The case is part of a broader pattern of undersea cable damage in the Baltic Sea, with some experts calling it a form of Russian hybrid warfare against Western infrastructure. In response, NATO has ramped up surveillance in the region.
Pro-Russian politician Badra Gunba has been declared the winner of the presidential runoff election in the breakaway Georgian region of Abkhazia. Vladimir Putin was quick to congratulate the new president.
Pro-Russian Badra Gunba secured 54.73% of the vote, defeating opposition candidate Adgur Ardzinba, who received 41.54%. The runoff followed a first round on February 15th, in which no candidate won a majority. Russian President Vladimir Putin swiftly congratulated Gunba, calling the election an expression of the Abkhazian people's free popular will. However, Georgia's government condemned the vote as illegal, reaffirming that Abkhazia remains sovereign Georgian territory. The region, which has been under de facto Russian control since the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, has been politically unstable for years. Gunba, the acting leader and former vice president, took over after protests forced out pro-Kremlin leader Aslan Janya in November over a controversial Russian investment bill.
And now it's time for a new segment on our show, East-splaining, where we shed light on issues from the Eastern point of view. In 1994, Ukraine surrendered its massive nuclear arsenal under the Budapest memorandum, trusting Russia and Western powers to safeguard its sovereignty. Decades later, Russia's invasions in 2014 and 2022 respectively shattered that trust, exposing the limits of international security guarantees.
At the time of the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, Ukraine possessed approximately 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads and thousands of tactical weapons, an arsenal larger than that of China, France and the UK combined. Despite this formidable deterrent, Ukraine faced immense pressure to denuclearize. The West feared proliferation risks, while Russia sought to consolidate control over former Soviet stockpiles. The Budapest Memorandum emerged as a compromise. Ukraine would join the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear state, and in return, its security would be guaranteed. For years, the agreement held as a symbol of post-Cold War cooperation. But cracks appeared in 2014 when Russia, citing unrest in Ukraine, annexed Crimea in a blatant violation of the memorandum. The West condemned the move, but offered little beyond sanctions and diplomatic protests. The 2022 invasion further exposed the agreement's fragility, as Russia's actions directly contradicted its commitments, leaving Ukraine to face a nuclear-armed aggressor without the deterrent it once held. The Budapest Memorandum's failure has sparked debate over the value of security assurances in international law. Critics argue it left Ukraine vulnerable, suggesting that retaining nuclear weapons might have deterred Russian aggression. Others contend that Ukraine's economic and political instability in the 1990s made maintaining a nuclear arsenal impractical.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.